The briefing did not begin with panic. It began with numbers. On a frost-covered morning in late January 1943, deep inside the reinforced concrete chambers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler's senior intelligence staff assembled around a long situation table still shadowed by the disaster at Stalingrad. Maps of the Eastern Front covered the walls, red arrows pressing west, German lines thinning, bending. But the real shock was not on the maps. It was in the production ledgers. General Reinhard Gehlen, head of Foreign Armies East, stood rigidly beside projection charts compiled from railway reconnaissance, factory surveillance, prisoner interrogations, and aerial photography. His voice remained clinical, but the data he delivered carried the weight of strategic catastrophe. Soviet tank production, approaching 2,000 per month. German output, barely 500. Aircraft production, over 2,500 Soviet machines monthly. Nearly double the Luftwaffe's replacement capacity. Artillery, ammunition, armored vehicles, all trending upward, all accelerating. Hitler listened in silence, hands clasped behind his back, pacing slowly across the concrete floor. Only weeks earlier, the 6th Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad, over 250,000 men lost in encirclement. Until then, he had blamed weather, commanders, logistics. But this briefing suggested something far more dangerous. The enemy was not weakening. He was industrializing. Gehlen explained how Soviet factories had not been destroyed in 1941 as German planners predicted. Instead, entire industrial complexes had been dismantled and evacuated east of the Ural Mountains. Beyond the reach of German bombers, beyond the advance of panzer armies, there, in frozen isolation, they had been rebuilt, and now they were outproducing the Reich. Field reports reinforced the intelligence. New Soviet formations were appearing with fresh equipment, T3 for tanks in numbers that absorbed losses without operational collapse. Entire artillery divisions were firing ammunition at rates German units could not match. Soviet air regiments, once shattered, were returning to the skies in growing strength. Hitler stopped pacing. For a moment, the room fell completely silent except for the rustle of paper maps. He asked one question, quiet, controlled, but edged with disbelief. How long can they sustain this? Gehlen did not hesitate. Indefinitely, especially with American and British Lend-Lease shipments supplying trucks, aluminum, aviation fuel, and industrial machinery. The implication was unavoidable. Germany had not entered a short war of maneuver. It had entered a prolonged industrial war against an enemy with deeper manpower reserves, expanding factory networks, and farm material support. For the first time since launching Operation Barbarossa, Hitler faced intelligence that could not be dismissed as pessimism or defeatism. The Lightning War. He designed to destroy the Soviet Union, and months had failed. And now, far beyond the frozen front lines, Soviet factories, not Soviet armies, were beginning to decide the outcome of the war. The factories were supposed to be destroyed in the first 6 weeks. That had been the assumption driving Operation Barbarossa. Strike fast, encircle Soviet armies, seize the industrial heartland west of the Urals, and the Soviet war machine would collapse before winter. German armored spearheads tore through Belarus and Ukraine in 1941 with that exact objective. Not just to defeat armies, but to strangle production. But as panzer divisions advanced deeper into Soviet territory, something unexpected was happening far behind the retreating front. The factories were disappearing, not destroyed by bombs, dismantled by their own workers. Under emergency directives from Moscow, an evacuation began on a scale no modern war had ever witnessed. Entire industrial complexes, steel mills, tank plants, aircraft assembly lines were taken apart piece by piece. Machinery was unbolted from concrete floors, loaded onto thousands of railway cars, and sent eastward in endless convoys stretching across the Soviet rail network. German reconnaissance aircraft reported rail lines clogged with freight moving away from the front, but intelligence analysts misread it as logistical chaos, not strategic relocation. By the time German forces captured key industrial cities, they found empty shells, silent workshops stripped of machinery, abandoned furnaces, vacant assembly halls, The industry they came to seize had already fled. The destination lay beyond the Ural Mountains, in Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, remote industrial zones previously developed. During Stalin's pre-war industrialization drive, these regions, once considered secondary production hubs, now became the core of Soviet survival. But relocation was only the beginning. Reconstruction took place under conditions that defied comprehension. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, operated in half-built factories without insulation, often without roofs. Machinery arrived before walls were finished. Production began in mud, snow, and freezing winds. Shifts ran 12 to 16 hours. Food was scarce. Housing was primitive, yet output rose. Tank assembly lines resumed within weeks. Aircraft production restarted while construction. Cranes still stood overhead. Entire armored vehicle plants were operational before German intelligence even realized they existed. The scale stunned even Soviet planners. Roughly 1,500 factories had been evacuated eastward between 1941 and 1942, along with millions of workers and their families. What German leadership believed was the destruction of Soviet industry was, in reality, its rebirth beyond reach, and the new factories were optimized for war. Simplified designs replaced complex pre-war engineering. Production prioritized durability, speed, and quantity. The goal was no longer technological elegance. It was battlefield saturation. By 1943, the results were undeniable. The Soviet Union was not merely replacing its losses. It was expanding to production beyond pre-invasion levels. What Germany had expected to be a dying industrial system had transformed into a wartime manufacturing colossus, shielded by distance, fueled by desperation, and driven by the singular objective of survival. The factories Barbarossa was meant to capture were now the very engines powering Germany's defeat. The truth did not arrive in reports. It arrived in steel, on the battlefield. By late 1942 and into 1943, German frontline commanders began reporting a pattern they could neither ignore nor overcome. Engagement after engagement, the Red Army was returning with more armor, more aircraft, more artillery, even after suffering losses that would have shattered any Western military force. Panzer crews first recognized the shift in the smoking wreckage of their own spearheads. The T-34 medium tank, once encountered in scattered numbers, was now appearing in mass formations. Its sloped armor deflected shells that earlier German anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate. Its wide tracks cut through mud and snow where German vehicles bogged down. Its 76mm gun could kill a Panzer IV at combat range. And there was never just one. Where German units destroyed 10, 20 more appeared. Where a Soviet breakthrough failed, another followed days later, supported by fresh mechanized reserves. Attrition was no longer symmetrical. German armored doctrine had always relied on qualitative superiority, better optics, better crew training, superior battlefield coordination. Those advantages still existed. German crews often destroyed more tanks than they lost. But now it no longer mattered, because the Soviets could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Above the battlefield, the sky told the same story. The armored silhouette of the IL-2 Sturmovik became a constant presence, flying low through anti-aircraft fire, unleashing rockets and cannon fire into German columns. Its armored fuselage absorbed damage that would tear apart conventional aircraft. Luftwaffe fighter units shot them down in large numbers. Yet they kept coming. Soviet factories were producing the ground attack aircraft at rates exceeding 1,000 per month. Entire air regiments could be rebuilt in weeks. Then came the artillery. German infantry learned to recognize the warning signs. Distant thunder not from weather, but from mass Soviet guns firing in coordinated barrages. Entire sectors of the front were pulverized under concentrated firepower. Ammunition expenditure on the Soviet side dwarfed German capacity. And when the rocket launchers arrived, the screaming salvos of Katyusha batteries, the psychological impact rivaled the physical. Destruction, positions vanished under firestorms of explosives. German reports grew increasingly grim. Enemy attacks no longer relied on maneuver brilliance alone. They were built on industrial abundance, tanks to absorb losses, aircraft to maintain pressure, artillery to break defensive lines before infantry even advanced. This was not blitzkrieg. This was material warfare. General Heinz Guderian, tasked with rebuilding Germany's armored forces, reviewed production intelligence with growing alarm. Even with accelerated German tank manufacturing and the development of heavier designs, like the Panther and Tiger, the numerical gap continued widening. Germany could build better machines, but it could not build enough of them. On the Eastern Front, tactical victories still occurred. German units still executed skillful defenses and devastating counterattacks, but every success came at a cost that could not be replaced. The Red Army, fueled by factories beyond the Urals, was fighting a war of exhaustion, and it was a war Germany was beginning to lose, not in strategy, but in production. Victory was supposed to be decided in one battle. That was the promise of Operation Citadel, Germany's Great Summer Offensive of 1943. After the disasters of winter and the growing evidence of Soviet industrial strength, Hitler sought one decisive armored blow that would shatter the Red Army's offensive capacity and restore strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The target was the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines formed after winter counteroffensives. From the German perspective, it was an opportunity. Strike from north and south, encircle the Soviet forces inside, and destroy their armored reserves in a single crushing maneuver. But what German planners did not fully grasp was that Soviet intelligence already knew the attack was coming, and more importantly, Soviet industry had given them the time and resources to prepare. By the time German forces assembled for the offensive in July 1943, the Kursk battlefield had been transformed into the most heavily fortified defensive zone in military history. Soviet engineers, supported by limitless material supply, constructed defensive belts stretching hundreds of kilometers, minefields layered upon minefields, anti-tank, anti-personnel, remote detonated charges, trenches zigzagged across the steppe, anti-tank guns were dug in by the thousands. Behind them waited armored reserves. Entire tank armies held back, fueled, armed, and ready. When the German assault began, it did so with some of the most advanced armored vehicles Germany had ever fielded. Panther tanks, fast, heavily armed. Tiger tanks, nearly invulnerable from the front. Ferdinand tank destroyers, built to kill at extreme range. This was Germany's technological answer to Soviet mass production. But technology could not erase mathematics. As German spearheads pushed into the defensive belts, they were slowed, then bled. Minefields crippled lead formations. Anti-tank guns struck from concealed positions. Soviet artillery saturated breakthrough corridors, and every kilometer gain cost irreplaceable machines. Then came the counterblow. At Prokhorovka, one of the largest armored clashes in history erupted as Soviet tank armies surged forward. Hundreds of T-34s charging into close-range combat. The battlefield dissolved into smoke, fire, and steel collisions at point-blank distance. German crews inflicted devastating losses. But the Soviet numbers did not collapse. They kept coming. Day after day, German commanders reported the same reality. Even successful engagements failed to break Soviet capacity. Destroyed Soviet tanks were replaced. Damaged formations reappeared. Fresh reserves entered the line. Meanwhile, Allied landings in Sicily forced Hitler to divert attention and resources westward. The offensive stalled, then it stopped. For the first time in the war, Germany had launched a major strategic attack and failed not because of weather, not because of surprise, but because the enemy possessed deeper defensive resources and greater industrial backing. Operation Citadel was terminated. From that moment forward, the initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Kursk was not just a battlefield defeat. It was the point where Germany's last realistic chance to regain momentum was consumed by the very industrial superiority Hitler had once dismissed. After Kursk, Germany would still fight fiercely, but it would never again dictate the pace of the war in the East. By 1944, the war was no longer being decided at the front. It was being decided in factories, and Germany was losing that war beyond recovery. Across the Eastern Front, German formations were digging in, fortifying rivers, cities, and defensive lines in a desperate attempt to slow the inevitable. But every defensive map Hitler studied showed the same pattern: Soviet offensives growing larger, deeper, and more coordinated. The scale was staggering. Where the Wehrmacht once advanced in sweeping encirclements, it now faced them. Soviet tank armies, each fielding hundreds of armored vehicles, punched through defensive sectors supported by artillery concentrations. Germany could no longer match. Barrages lasted hours, sometimes days, consuming ammunition in quantities German industry could not replace. Above them, waves of aircraft maintained constant pressure. Behind them rolled endless supply columns, many carried not on Soviet trucks, but on American Lend-Lease vehicles. Hundreds of thousands of Studebakers, jeeps, and transport carriers gave the Red Army mobility that multiplied its operational reach. The industrial alliance against Germany had become global. Inside the Reich, Albert Speer's armaments ministry pushed production to unprecedented levels. Tank output doubled, aircraft production surged, new weapons, Panthers, Tigers, advanced artillery rolled off assembly lines at record pace. But even Speer's production miracle could not close the gap, because Germany was fighting not one industrial giant, but several. Soviet factories east of the Urals produced tanks in numbers exceeding German output. American industry produced aircraft and vehicles on a scale unmatched in history. British production sustained air and naval supremacy. Germany, bombed from the air and starved of resources, was outmatched in every industrial category that mattered. The consequences unfolded brutally on the battlefield. In June 1944, Operation Bagration erupted, a Soviet offensive so massive it annihilated Germany's Army Group Center. Entire divisions vanished. Defensive lines collapsed under artillery fire, and armored breakthroughs executed with mechanical precision. It was blitzkrieg, reversed. And it was powered not by daring maneuver alone, but by overwhelming industrial supply. German soldiers at the front began to understand the reality long before Berlin admitted it. No matter how fiercely they fought, the enemy replaced losses faster. Destroyed tanks returned in greater numbers. Downed aircraft were replaced within weeks. Morale eroded under the weight of inevitability. Hitler, still clinging to visions of miracle weapons and decisive reversals, was forced to confront the truth he had resisted since that intelligence briefing in 1943. Modern total war was not decided by ideology, nor by tactical brilliance alone. It was decided by steel output, fuel reserves, transport capacity, and production endurance. The Soviet Union, once dismissed as an inferior industrial state, had become the engine driving Germany's destruction. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Bagration to the Vistula, the factories Hitler failed to destroy were now carrying the Red Army to Berlin. And when Soviet troops finally raised their flag over the Reichstag in 1945, the victory belonged not only to soldiers, but to the millions of workers, engineers, and evacuated factories beyond the Urals whose industrial power had sealed the fate of the Third Reich.